Do you ever notice that when you're not feeling good and you're not thinking straight, your breathing is usually out of whack? That when you're stressed, anxious, or angry, usually your breathing pattern corresponds to your state of mind, right? In this video series, we're going to look at how our breathing affects our overall health and well-being, both from the point of view of modern science and our ancient wisdom traditions. We're really going to unpack the subject of breathing without any hype or exaggerated claims. In fact, I'm going to give you all the references for every claim I make. In today's video, we're specifically going to look at the very common negative habit of mouth breathing and how it can seriously harm your sleep quality, your cognitive performance, even the structure of your face as you're growing up, and many other things. So stay tuned. Hey everyone, this is Timo and welcome back to Integral Wellbeing. When you think about what's important to your well-being, you usually think about your basic needs, right? I need food, water, shelter, clothing, medicine, things like that. But if you think about it, breathing is actually your number one basic need. You can go without food for weeks and without water for days, but you can't go without breathing for more than a few minutes. We have so much evidence that breathing has a huge effect on every function in our body, and yet we learn almost nothing about it in school. Not only that, but many of us have unconsciously adopted very unhealthy breathing patterns that could be sapping your energy and negatively impacting your well-being without you even realizing it. So today we're going to look at one of the most fundamental questions in what is healthy breathing, which is, should you be breathing through your mouth or through your nose? I first discovered the dangers of mouth breathing in a book in 2020 by James Nestor called Breath. I highly recommend it. This book was one of the finalists for the Royal Society Science Book Prize in 2021, which is one of the main scientific authorities in the world. So there was clearly something here to be explored. Unfortunately, when I started reading the book, there were actually some substantial mistakes which I happen to know because of my background in Tibetan Buddhism when he talks about things like tumo, inner fire practice. But that's a subject for another video in this series. So first of all, let's look at how common mouth breathing actually is. It seems to vary, but in many studies, the prevalence of this is around 50% of the population. So in this study, they looked at a population in Brazil where they found a 55% prevalence of mouth breathing among children aged 3 to 9 years old. That is shockingly high. In this other study, they noticed that most children, around 53%, were considered oral breathers, in other words, mouth breathers. They also mentioned that there are some other studies where they found a prevalence of as high as 77%, 3/4 of kids. So in other words, there's not a lot of studies on this, but clearly it's a very common phenomenon. One of the first things I noticed when I started looking at the scientific literature on mouth breathing was that it significantly lowers the oxygen levels in your blood. In this particular study, they were looking at about 323 patients with mouth breathing and discovered that as many as 65% of them were technically hypoxemic, which is to say that their oxygen saturation was at 95% or below. Now that's actually serious oxygen deprivation. You want your oxygen saturation to be 99 ideally. In this study, they looked at the effect of mouth breathing on subcutaneous oxygen tension, which is the oxygen level in tissue just below the skin. They found that in 6 out of 8 subjects, their subcutaneous oxygen tension was 10% higher during periods of nasal breathing versus mouth breathing. Now, why is that the case? A major role seems to be played by a gas called nitric oxide that is produced in the membranes in your nose when you breathe through them. The vasodilator gas nitric oxide is produced in the paranasal sinuses and is excreted continuously into the nasal airways of humans. This nitric oxide will normally reach the lungs with inspiration, especially during nasal breathing. Right? So how cool is that? Your nose, tissues inside your nose produce this gas that actually dilates blood vessels, which helps you absorb more oxygen in the lungs. Another thing we know is that mouth breathing results in shallower breathing, which means less air actually gets to the bottom of the lungs where most of the gas exchange takes place. In this study, they looked at 38 mouth breathers and 38 nose breathers, and they showed that mouth breathing reflected on lower recruitment of the accessory inspiratory muscles during fast inspiration and lower diaphragmatic amplitude compared to nasal breathing. What that means is that the diaphragm is not getting used as much, and so the breathing is less deep, which is a big deal because deeper breathing means more oxygen absorption and more of a dampening of our natural stress response. This was again confirmed in this other study where they showed that mouth breathing results in less pulmonary volumes, in other words, less air coming in. Another interesting fact about mouth breathing is that it gives you less of a defense against bacteria and viruses in the air that you're breathing in. This nitric oxide that is produced in the sinuses actually is a compound that can kill bacteria and viruses. In this study, they stated that nitric oxide is a free radical that exerts antibacterial effects as a part of the human body's innate immune defense. In this study, they go on to state that the mucosal membrane inside of our sinuses actually produces bactericidal levels of nitric oxide that increase ciliary beating, which is the airway's major physical defense. But it also kills viruses. They go on to state the production of endogenous nitric oxide also exerts antiviral effects against common human respiratory viruses. Nitric oxide is able to not only inactivate viral particles, but also modulate the host immune response that usually triggers an inflammatory response. So how cool is that? Just by breathing through your nose, you produce a gas that actually kills bacteria and viruses, thereby decreasing your risk of respiratory infections, which we will show in other studies. One little fun fact in this study is that apparently you can create a significant increase in the production of nitric oxide by humming. Compared to quiet exhalation, a transient acceleration of sinus ventilation produced by humming phonation, and yes, I checked it, it does actually mean humming, increased the nitric oxide level in the nasal airflow by 15-fold. So next time you have a cold coming on or you feel like you're getting an infection, why not spend some time humming? Now let's look at the impact of mouth breathing on sleep, where it does some of the most damage. This study showed that nighttime mouth breathing significantly increases the incidence of sleep apnea and snoring, which according to sleep expert Dr. Matthew Walker can significantly harm the quality of your sleep. So what can you do about it? As it turns out, mouth breathing at night can be significantly improved by simply taping your mouth shut. In this study, they go on to state that mouth taping during sleep improved snoring and the severity of sleep apnea in mouth breathers with mild obstructive sleep apnea. That's pretty amazing. I've read the same thing in James Nestor's book, and he actually recommends just buying some really basic tape from the grocery store that you can just tape over your mouth to keep it closed when you're sleeping. Another crazy effect of mouth breathing is that it seems to have a very negative effect on your oral health. In this study, they stated that consequences resulting from mouth breathing habits include malocclusion, in other words, teeth crowding, crooked teeth, the deterioration of oral hygiene, increased prevalence of caries, in other words, holes in the teeth, periodontal diseases of the gums, which actually produce a lot of our bad breath, and abnormal maxillofacial growth. Now, we're going to look at that next, how oral breathing actually seems to change the structure of your face, which is pretty scary. In this study, they stated that daily mouth breathing gradually induces negative changes in the bone structure and overall facial appearance, such as a narrow face, mouth and nose, higher upper palate, retruded mandible, an elevated position of the hyoid bone, malocclusion, crowded and crooked teeth, secondary halitosis, that's bad breath, open bite and dysfunctional jaw joint, dental problems, again bad breath, dental decay, and gum disease. Who would have thought that just breathing through your mouth could make you stinky? So, okay, this is all very interesting, but what about performance? I mean, let's say I'm an athlete, I like to go to the gym, I like to work out, I like to do sports. how does it affect my athletic performance? One of the things I found out is that mouth breathing makes you lose about 40% more water from the air that you breathe out. This study showed that the net water loss increased by 42% when the breathing mode was switched from nasal to oral expiration during tidal breathing in healthy subjects. So again, you lose a lot more water. In another study, mouth breathing was associated with exercise-induced bronchoconstriction, which means that the muscles in your airway actually tighten up, which is also what can happen when you have allergies. In one of the latest studies on mouth breathing and how it affects athletic performance, they looked at the effect of mouth breathing specifically on strength training or resistance training as opposed to endurance training. In the paper, they state that in aerobic endurance sports, better breathing efficacy due to nasal breathing appears to improve physiological economy or efficiency by improving ventilatory efficiency in subjects previously adapted to breathing this way. However, in context of resistance training, the potential effects of different breathing patterns appear to have no meaningful influence. In other words, when you read it in context, it basically means that aerobic training, endurance training, seems to really benefit from nasal breathing, whereas when you do the tests for resistance training, such as doing a bench press in this case, you don't really see any real benefit. However, the paper does state that another line of reasoning suggests that a greater diaphragm activation, which we've seen before, due to nasal breathing could lead to better torso stabilization and therefore potentially injury prevention and performance support. But they argue more research is needed. So when you think about things like squatting and deadlifting, where the diaphragm is really important for stabilizing the torso, maybe nasal breathing could be beneficial. Now, finally, how can mouth breathing potentially affect the workings of your mind? Maybe the craziest thing is that there's actually quite a few studies out there showing that chronic mouth breathing seems to increase the incidence of ADHD in children. In this randomized experiment, daily mouth breathing gradually induces a higher prevalence of ADHD. That's pretty crazy. In this paper in the prestigious scientific journal Nature, they go on to state that children with mouth breathing possess poorer reading comprehension and working memory than those without mouth breathing. So in sum, it's interesting to see that most of the studies you can find on mouth breathing and how it affects our health clearly show that it has pretty much only negative effects, and that when people switch to nose breathing, almost everything improves. It's also very interesting that pretty much every ancient wisdom tradition and every school of yoga and breathwork around the world recommends nasal breathing for almost all situations. Whether you're looking at Indian yoga, Tibetan yoga, Chinese Qigong, Neigong, or Tai Chi, and even the Native Americans. In Nestor's book Breath, he talks about the research of George Catlin, who created the first, last, and only complete record ever made of the Plains Indians at the height of their splendid culture. Nestor writes that every tribe Catlin visited over the next several years, dozens of them, shared the same breathing habits. They all breathe through their nose pretty much all the time. It was no coincidence, he reported, that they also shared the same vigorous health, perfect teeth, and forward-growing facial structure. Whether that's the only reason they were like that, probably not. But again, we've seen some of these studies where mouth breathing really affects the growth of the facial structure and how your teeth end up developing. So I think in summary, we can say that basically the mouth is for eating, and you should only really use it for breathing if you really have to, when you're engaging in strenuous exercise. If you like this type of video, please like, comment, subscribe, and share. I'm currently also in the process of creating online courses where you can learn how to implement some of these insights into your daily life using evidence-based behavior change strategies so that you can actually change your habits long term. If you'd like to be notified when these come out, please leave your email in the form in the description, and we will be sure to reach out to you once they come out. Also, stay tuned for the next video series, where we're going to look at the next important factor for our well-being, which is our nutrition, and how to wade through the morass of conflicting information about food and our well-being.